So, I mean, I can talk sort of, uh, in a more elliptical manner about some of the results there. If you,
I think, I mean, I don't know how to say this. People love set theory. They really do. All right, let's start.
okay,
I'm Cody Rue. This is the Church of Logic, and I'm delighted to have Joel David Hamkins, who's currently a professor of philosophy at Notre Dame, but who, many of you have probably heard of as being extremely active in the field of set theory. He has tons of really, really cool results. And I think he's the top performer on Math Overflow, which personally I think to be the highest of honors. And he has some really interesting things to say about set theory, and we're going to try and get him to say some of these things today on the Church of Logic.
well, thank you so much. It's so pleasure to be here.
Great. Yeah, I'm glad you came. Let's see, I did have a list of questions, but let's start it off with a very open-ended one, and then we'll see where we end up. So the very open-ended question is, what kinds of things do you care about in set theory? What kinds of things do you really, at a high level, want to know about set theory? And what are kind of the devices you use to try to answer these big questions?
I see. That's a sweeping question. I'm not sure that I have a satisfactory answer. I mean, and I think maybe uh, like any mathematician, I mean, you ask a mathematician, well, why are you looking at that, or why did you prove that theorem? And the answer is going to be something close to because I was able to do it. I was able to prove it. We prove the things that we can succeed at doing.
Right,
So
right,
in the
right.
beginning, years ago and so on, then of course one is happy to prove any theorem at all that's new and then build on it and so on. Okay, but after a while, one can be a little choosier and make distinctions. And I came to find sort of what is my style of mathematics. My style, the way I would say what it is I like mainly, I strongly prefer easy mathematics. I mean, arguments that you can understand and that furthermore lead to a result that you didn't expect. So I tend to be kind of like, I mean, I would contrast it with this sort of big machinery kind of arguments where you're participating in a huge project with many, many moving parts and it's all very complicated and so on, but you understand it, how it fits together, and you're working on some small part. This is not what I do at all. And rather, I like to work on topics where the question is so easy to ask, and the answer actually turns out to be easy but unexpected. And this is quite a nice situation when it happens. And so that's sort of how I would frame myself. But in terms of the topics of what I work on, I mean, it's just a huge breadth. I mean, I've worked on large cardinals and the strong axioms of infinity and forcing and the interaction between them and models of set theory, and that led me into sort of looking at models of set theory from a modal point of view, particularly in regard to forcing, and then that grew into a more general model theoretic approach to modal theory. But I've also done things with infinite computability and set theoretic mereology and
Right.
also infinite games and I have some results in group theory and so on. So I've worked on a lot of different topics, but I'm generally seeking out these kind of, these nice morsels of things that you can understand easily, but are a surprise. I don't know. This
That's a
was
great answer. Let's see. I think I'm gonna try and pull the thread,
okay.
mostly in the perhaps the modal set theory bit
Sure.
and perhaps the large cardinals bit. As I tried to ask early in the questions. The thing I'm fascinated with in logic is kind of self-reflection. I don't know what this says about me psychologically, but I'm fascinated when a logic can learn a little bit about itself, and also I'm fascinated when a logic can't learn something about itself without becoming inconsistent.
Right, right.
This I don't know, somehow it terrifies me, right? And I think my fascination comes from, the incompleteness theorem, way back in
Right.
childhood. But I feel like I see this phenomenon pop up in different ways. And um, the, the the gut feeling I get, but feel free to tell me I'm wrong about your research, is that it does kind of embrace this view of like, who am I as, a mathematical entity living in this mathematical universe? And I might want to pull at that thread as well a little bit,
Right.
but and what can I know about myself and what can I know about other things?
Oh, I
And
see.
and I don't know. Again, I wonder if there's kind of a theme there that you feel compelled by.
Oh, I see. Oh, absolutely. I mean, sort of, reacting to what you said, I'm just reminded immediately of my proof of the universal algorithm theorem, which isn't about set theory so much as arithmetic or computability theory, but it's really quite fascinating because it is partaking in a deep way with this self-reflection and self-reference. I mean, so the universal algorithm is the following theorem. Uh, there's a computer program and we can write it down. I mean, it's not like just an existence proof. We can actually write it down. There's a computer program that has a remarkable property, namely, um, whatever behavior you would want it to have in terms of its input output, then it's consistent with the axioms of mathematics, with, say, piano arithmetic, that specific program has that behavior. So, in other words, it's consistent, for example, that this program, which we can write down, it's consistent that this program on input one gives you back the number six, or on input two gives you back the number 17, or whatever you want it to do. It's consistent with PA that it does that.
Right. So let's see if I can rephrase this and you can tell me if I have it wrong. So this is an algorithm. You write down this algorithm. It performs some kind of search. I hope I'm
Yes,
not spoiling
yes,
the
yeah,
the
that's right.
punchline. And that search, as far as PA knows, as far as, a person who only knows theorems of piano arithmetic knows, and if piano arithmetic is consistent, which I know is implicit in these kinds of things, but I do like to say it. Um, as far as PA knows, it the output could be anything. Um,
That's right.
and really, yeah, for any input, it could be any output.
That's
And
right.
okay, so I
So therefore,
didn't.
by compactness, it follows, by the compactness theorem, that for any function on the natural numbers to the natural numbers, for any function whatsoever, f, even if it's not computable, then it's consistent with PA that my algorithm, that the universal algorithm on input n gives you back f of n
um,
for any function.
okay,
So it's
so
sort of like, okay, I mean, but I said it's
so
consistent with PA that. And the model in which that's realized, of course, it won't be the standard model of arithmetic, but rather will be some non-standard model of arithmetic. Okay, with these sort of infinite numbers, non-standard numbers, and the length of time that my algorithm takes to give you those outputs f of n on input n is going to be a non-standard amount of time. So we're sort of running the program inside this weird non-standard model in order to achieve that target value f of n that we wanted. And in
so
fact, in the standard model, the algorithm simply never halts at all. It can't, because if it ever did halt with a specific output, then PA would prove that about it, and it couldn't have a different value then. So therefore, it's computing the empty function in the standard model of arithmetic, but it's consistent with PA. There's this other world of arithmetic in which that algorithm, the very same algorithm, is computing this other function on the standard inputs.
I this is a great result. I have some follow-up questions. I
It's
knew
not
about
my theorem, by the way. The way I've stated it so far is a weaker version of a much stronger theorem that's due to Hugh Wooden, and for which I provided a simplified proof. But so we
great.
can get into that
Okay,
in
great, great. Okay. Theorem by Hume you reproved. I have many questions about this. I deliberately did not bring up this specific theorem because my feelings are so strong about it that I was afraid that I would irk you with all my
Oh,
questions.
I see. Well, that's totally fine. I can tell you what the algorithm is if you want to hear it. I mean, it's pretty
Okay,
simple.
let me take a guess about what the algorithm is. I did
Okay.
read the paper though, so perhaps I'm just
Oh, okay, great.
remembering the
Right.
algorithm. Um, it basically you identify a function for which PA can prove nothing. Um, like let's see.
P is
Um,
the program or what? Or
it just let's see. Sorry, I'm not sure I do have a proof. I feel like you're
okay.
going to take really
Okay.
strong theories and then basically going to look for proofs of inconsistency in those theories, which of
It's
course PA can't
something like that.
exclude. And then those proofs of inconsistencies, you're somehow going to map their length or something into the number that you're looking to compute.
It's
Um,
something like that. I mean, there's many arguments of that form, but this particular one, it's in the same family as those arguments, but it's maybe less objectionable. I mean,
okay,
what the universal algorithm does for proving the version of the sort of baby version that I stated, it's the following. Uh, the program on a given input um, searches for a proof about itself. Okay, that's the self-referential aspect, which is why I'm mentioning this, because you were talking about referring to yourself. So the algorithm searches for a proof about itself, a proof in PA. We're not looking at stronger theories, but just PA, piano arithmetic. The algorithm looks for a proof about itself that it does not obey with a certain explicitly listed input-output table, a finite input-output table. Okay, so in other words, consider statements of the form program E does not conform exactly with this input-output table where the numbers are listed explicitly. If I find a proof of such a statement that the program itself does not conform with that table, then I immediately act in conformance with that table.
great, great. Okay, okay, okay.
Okay,
So
that's what the algorithm does.
all right, so let's see. I can't remember if sorry. I can't remember if I explained this algorithm that refers to itself trick. I may have, but it's a beautiful trick, right? Any algorithm can, consistently take its own source code as input.
Well, this
And
is the Kleene recursion
the
theorem.
Kleene
Exactly.
recursion theorem, right? This really magical theorem that allows you to build quines and systems that
It's
print
simple.
themselves, or a system that print themselves, but in a different programming language. And then that program that they prints it in the first language. Anyway,
You can make these long chains, these, or
yes,
what are they
yes,
called?
yes.
Ouroboros chains,
Ouroboros,
like
yes.
translating from Python to
Yeah,
Java,
that's
C+,
delightful.
or
It's actually quite
whatever.
hard. Anybody at home who's never tried to write a coin, it's surprisingly hard. As far as I'm concerned, I don't know. But okay, so this program takes some input and it says, look for a proof in PA that I don't have this finite specified behavior of input outputs. All
Yeah.
right,
And
and
when you
that's pretty
find such a
straightforward.
proof, maybe you find such a proof. Maybe you don't. Maybe you never find it, in which case you never are giving any output.
Great. And if you
But
find
of
such a
course,
proof, you immediately do the opposite. So it's kind of like the halting problem where, there's this contradictory thing that assumes a halting oracle exists. It looks for such a proof and it immediately, does the opposite. And
right.
and the conclusion, the halting problem is there is no halting algorithm there, therefore. But here, what we're saying is, no, there is such a program. And it's pretty clear to us who believe that PA is consistent that it will never halt because if it did, it would do something
Yeah.
pathological.
So that's a proof, for example, that it can't halt at any standard number stage because if it did, if it did find such a proof, I mean, you can't prove that it doesn't have any particular behavior Because if you could, then it would have that behavior. So you would have been proving something false. So, right? So,
Yes.
I mean, I call this algorithm the petulant child algorithm because what the program does is it looks for a proof that it doesn't have a certain behavior, and then it immediately does that thing. It looks
Yes,
for
yes, 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 yes,
the
yes.
forbidden rule and then immediately violates it, right?
That's a great analogy. All
So
right. So here's
if you could refute a particular finite behavior for this program, it then it would have that behavior for the least such proof.
here's a question that I can't immediately answer in my head. And perhaps it's useful to pose that question. So you say this algorithm can have any input-output behavior that is specified,
Yeah.
that you can specify. I think it probably we need to unwind that you can specify behavior
What-
because surely imagine you told PA this algorithm actually computes the busy beaver, right? If PA knew that, then you would have a contradiction, right?
Yeah.
So PA, the way you specify that input-output behavior had better be somewhat mysterious, at least as far as the logical theory itself is concerned.
Right. Well, let's just give the proof actually, because we're quite close to it. I mean, already it's not a difficult theorem. So this is an example of, how to prove it in a very easy manner. So what we said is, so I defined the algorithm. The algorithm searches for a proof that the algorithm doesn't conform with a certain finite lookup table, and then if it finds such a proof, it conforms with that table. That's what the algorithm does. It's almost a complete description, and we could clearly write such a program down. I mean, we'd have to formalize the proof system and so on in order to do it, but this is done already, and it's in principle possible to write it down. And now what we said is you can't refute any particular finite behavior of the program, because if you could refute that, then there would be such a proof and it would find such a proof and then it would have, so you would have proved something false. Okay, so therefore you can't refute any finite behavior for the machine. But that's just another way of saying it's consistent that it does have that behavior. I mean, that's what it means to be consistent, is that you can't refute it. So therefore, it's consistent. Just because you can't refute that finite behavior, it follows that it's consistent that it does have that behavior. That's what it would mean to be consistent. You can't prove it's not true. And therefore, any any finite behavior for the function is consistently produced by it's consistent with PA that this program produces that finite result. And now we can get this sort of infinite version just by a simple compactness argument, namely for any function f that you want, and I'm not taking f under a description, I'm just taking it, as a function. I can write down a
You mean
theory.
as input-output pairs is what you
Yeah,
mean.
I can write down a theory. You give me any function whatsoever.
I
Maybe it's
see.
the busy beaver function. Then I write down a certain theory which says my program, the universal algorithm, on input one gives back f of one, and on input two gives back f of two. And
Great.
so that's an infinite list of statements, and any finitely many of them we just said is consistent. So therefore, the whole thing is consistent. So therefore,
Great.
there's a model of PA in which this algorithm has the busy beaver values, the true
Great.
busy beaver values.
Okay. So I get it. So P there's definitely no contradiction here, right? PA can definitely prove that there is no algorithm that prints out the busy beaver function.
Yeah,
However, it can't prove that, this particular algorithm doesn't happen to print, the first busy beaver value for the first function and the
yeah,
second busy beaver
yeah,
value for for two, and then the third busy beaver value for three. And
exactly.
then somehow PA is like both knowing that this algorithm couldn't possibly print the busy beavers for each input, but
Yeah,
also, for each individual input, it does,
right.
in this
Exactly.
hypothetical theory that would be
So
hard to write down.
in the model of PA in which my function does have the values of the busy beaver function, inside that model, the busy beaver version in that model is different. It's much bigger because in fact, the number of steps that my program took to give an answer for the first number is much bigger than the standard busy beaver value, that would arise. So therefore, all the computation time of my program is definitely non-standard in this model, and that by itself already forces all the busy beaver values to be also non-standard in this model. So this model has its own version of the busy beaver function, which agrees only finitely with the actual
I
busy
see.
beaver function.
So, okay. So this is really like, I apologize again. This is a subject of conversation I feel strongly about, but I explicitly
Uh-huh.
wanted to avoid. So, at any moment, tell me like, let's talk about something else, and I'll be happy to. But there's two things here that I want to
Right.
say.
Okay.
One, often when I read your papers, when you make these arguments, you often say, oh, but in this model, in this non-standard model, this function, this thing runs forever. In the
Right.
standard model, in the non-standard model, it halts at some
Right.
non-standard integer. I personally, so I've noticed logicians, they tend to have a field, and then they tend to talk about meta theory. That's their whole job. They talk
Right.
about what these logic proves, and it amuses me that they often use the same language. It's not surprising, but they use the same language to talk about the meta theory as the theory themselves that they tend to study, right? And so
Right.
finitists tend to use these very elementary methods to talk about meta theory. And set theorists, no, they go ham.
Yeah,
They create
they
these
just
gigantic
take it all on
models.
board. Right.
Um, and so this is something that I've noticed in forcing too. In forcing, they're like, oh, this is just, a thing that takes in a proof in this theory and turns it into a different proof in this different theory. And I'm like, great, show me that transformation. And they're like, no, 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 we're not going to show you the transformation. We're going to build models because everybody loves models and everybody hates proof theory. And I'm like, no, I love proof theory. And here you did the same thing, kind of, right? You said, here's a very elementary, proof theoretic proof, right? I can show I know what's consistent, I'm assuming PA is consistent, and I'm going to show you that this further theory that I can describe is somehow consistent.
Right.
But then you immediately said, oh yeah, this is a non-standard integer, and I've never really seen a non-standard integer, right? That
Oh, I
they
see.
they they are very intangible to me. What's very tangible to me is theories, with finite sets of axioms or axioms that are easy to describe.
Right.
And it just it makes me a little bit sad because every time I read one of these papers, I have to translate it back into my language of finite
Right.
things with finite
Right.
descriptions and finite proofs. And I was wondering if, let's see, how do you feel about this? Do you not even, this doesn't even register
No, it
on your
does. I mean,
conscious level?
I have strong feelings about it.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think it's a kind of core dispute in logic. There's a kind of dichotomy between this proof theoretic way of understanding what mathematics is about, what the whole project is, and the kind of alternative. I mean, the question really is what is logic about? Is it about proofs and reasoning, or is it about like expressivity of formal languages and truth, right?
yes,
These are
yes, yes, yes,
totally
yes.
different approaches to this subject. And I think that you're on one side and I'm on the other side, and I have the
Great.
same kind of dispute with other people, right? For example, I mean, if one takes, look, if you're a mathematician and you want to understand, mathematical structure of various kinds, you define graphs and groups and so on. And we can think about different mathematical structures of various kinds, and we want to understand what the features are, and maybe we have a formal language that we're going to express those features in, and we want to know what is the expressive power of those languages with regard to that structure that we define, and we want to know what's true. I mean, to say that it has a feature is just a truth assertion about the model, right? And so I haven't said anything about argument or reasoning or inference rules in this view. And so the point is that it's an extremely natural approach to mathematics, in my view, to be concerned with truth first. And in light of the developments of mathematical logic, and we have proof systems and so on, and we can prove the completeness theorem and compactness and so on, and all of that is great. But in a sense, the meaning of the completeness theorem shows that the proof theoretic point of view is dispensable. We don't need it precisely because something is provable if and only if it holds in all models of the theory. That's a way of stating the completeness theorem. And so, okay, from the proof theory point of view, that sounds great because it shows the power of the proof theoretic point of view that, look, we can prove all the validities in this system. So we don't need ever to talk about models. We can just think about proofs and the proof systems and the, and always just work in the proof system. But from the other side of the dichotomy, the view can be, look, we don't need to think about proofs ever. We can just talk about what's true. And however it is that we can make those conclusions about what's true, maybe because we're working in a stronger meta theory or we have other tools that don't conform with the rules of a deductive system, but we can still use them to arrive at what features a particular mathematical structure has. So these are two really, I think, diametrically opposed perspectives on what logic and even mathematics is about. And I think it's important to understand these two perspectives. For example, in the disputes between, say, constructive logic and classical logic, they're lining up on this dichotomy very much because a lot of the arguments that one finds in connection with constructive logic, they just don't really get any traction from the truth point of view. They just seem irrelevant from this other point
Okay,
of
that's great. This really actually brings me right to the cusp of the second point I wanted to make,
view. Okay.
so full disclosure, right? I guess yeah, I really am in that first camp, I guess you
Yeah, I
described.
would have assumed that from because I
Eh,
know that you have strong views on
Yeah,
who.
yeah, yeah. And my feeling is truth is not is just not a notion that's meaningful, right? But so okay, so we described this algorithm, and we showed that under the assumption that P is consistent again, great. But then immediately you said, oh, but in the standard model of arithmetic, of course this doesn't hold, right? We
Yes,
know that in the real model of arithmetic this doesn't
right,
hold. And now this dichotomy where you said, oh, the completeness theorem completely dispenses us to think about truth. No,
right.
it doesn't work here because you referred to the standard model, and now the completeness theorem does not say anything about the standard model. In fact,
Oh, I see. But in ZFC, for example, if my meta theory is ZFC, which is what I usually take it to be,
sure.
then I can prove that there's a standard model of arithmetic in ZFC. I mean, omega and so on. I mean, I can prove Dedekind's theorem in ZFC, and that's what one means by the standard model. So if one has adopted ZFC as a kind of standard background theory for mathematics, which I'm not saying it's the only point of view, but it is certainly a quite standard point of view to adopt, especially amongst set theorists, then talking about the standard model isn't suspicious in any way. This is just I'm just doing model theory and in ZFC I'm doing model theory and I'm doing the model theory of arithmetic. And so I have the standard model of PA and I have various non-standard models of PA, which I can construct by ultra powers, or I can get them, via pass-through trees
Sure, 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 sure.
Hamkins proof and so on. And so it's not sort of problematic in any way to refer to the standard model of arithmetic on that point of view.
It's not, but I don't feel like it has much more strength than saying the things we prove in arithmetic, right? Because
Oh, I see.
because in
Well,
arithmetic, the standard model is just, in PA, right? The
it's
standard
not.
model is just all the numbers.
No, it's different because the truths of the standard model that would be called true arithmetic, not PA. It's a much bigger theory. It's a complete theory. I mean, every particular model satisfies a complete theory, but we can't describe what that theory.
Right, right, right. Okay. So here, I feel like here's really the disagreement. You're saying there is some complete theory out there. Of course, we
Yeah,
can't know it. It's unknowable
right,
to us.
right,
And I feel like this is the Gödel position, right? This is Gödel is like, yeah, the truth is out there, right? Kind of X-Filesy.
right.
Uh, sorry, that's a strange association of thought. Yeah, I can imagine Godot watching the X-Files. Anyway, so yeah, so the truth is out there. We just can't know it because we're these finite humans, but
But that way
angels.
of saying it, it sounds like like, excuse me, like arithmetic monism. I mean, for example, I mean, there's these pluralism issues that come in, right? Namely, do we think that there's just one unique, absolute arithmetic truth, or do we think actually we don't? There's a kind of plural attitude, and I'm a pluralist about arithmetic just as much as set theory, and so I wouldn't agree that there is this single unique arithmetic truth out there that's
Okay,
just
okay.
somehow eternal and absolute. Rather, I'm just arguing in ZFC, and ZFC proves as a standard model, but different models of ZFC are going to have different arithmetic
Great,
structures
great,
in
great, great.
standard models and different truths for that standard model.
So it sounds like somehow we resolve this tension of like now in the meta theory, right? There's some arithmetic we think is true, but we know, right, from the incompleteness theorem that that is also subject to disagreement. The way we resolve that tension is different. You resolve it by saying we live in this multiverse and we don't really know what world we live in. And I say there is no such thing as truth. We have proof systems. ZFC proves things, PA proves things, and the multiverse is just, hypothetical extensions of those things. And it's
I
this
see.
very formalist view.
Yeah, I think
And
these are these two radically different perspectives that I was trying to
great,
describe
great, great,
earlier. And I think we're on opposite sides, but it's
great.
fine. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
because I don't think actually, I mean, the interesting thing about philosophy of mathematics, the kind that I'm most interested in, is that um, you have different philosophical positions on a subject matter, but you never disagree about like whether the theorem
yes,
is proved or
yes,
not.
yes, 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 yes.
We agree on all the proofs, but we're disagreeing about something that's not even part of the mathematics, about what it means and what it's about and so on. But I think that those philosophical approaches are extremely important to think about and deeply because they direct you towards the interesting mathematics, right? If you're on the proof theory side, like you were describing of this dichotomy, then you're going to be, I think, led to certain kinds of mathematical enterprises. For example, reverse mathematics is going to be, a major concern. And also you're going to end up, I think, looking a lot at very weak theories. There's going to be a focus on weaker theories and what's provable and what's not provable in weaker theories. Whereas if you're a kind of universe view like Wooden or something, then if you think there's one eternal truth, one eternal set theoretic universe with absolute truth, then you're going to be naturally trying to find out what's true in that theory, and that's going to push you towards stronger and stronger theories because you think you have the answer, and so you're going to want the largest large cardinals and so on, and the strongest axioms that are available. Whereas if you're a pluralist, a set theoretic pluralist as I am, then you're going to be naturally inclined to thinking about this sort of spectrum of universes that are available and how do they relate to one another, and that's going to lead to things like modal logic of forcing and modal model theory and geology, set theoretic geology, and all those topics come, they're mathematical projects, but they come from the philosophical perspective that we're talking about.
Great. That was fantastic. You're making my job very easy. All right, so tell me about one of these, pluralist inspired results.
Oh, I see.
So
So, okay, there's a really nice one that's related to something that you
great.
mentioned. Namely, it's a theorem I have with Ruji Yang at Fudan University in Shanghai. And we have a paper called Satisfaction is Not Absolute, which is on the archive. And the theorem
That's
says
a
the
great name.
following. Uh, so, assuming ZFC, the set theory, is consistent, then there can be two models of ZFC. Models of ZFC can be very different from one another. For example, they don't generally have to agree on the ordinals or even on the natural numbers. The sets of natural numbers could be non-standard in one and standard in another or whatever. They could be incomparable. This kind of weird situation can happen. But what Rougy and I proved is that there are two models of set theory that have exactly the same natural numbers. It's identical. The structure of the natural numbers is identical in them. But they don't agree on which arithmetic sentences are true in that structure. So this is what I mean by satisfaction is not absolute. Truth is not absolute between these models. So what it shows is
So
it's teasing apart. They have the same numbers, but they don't have the same number theory. Is
okay,
what.
this is great because I understand almost none of that. Let's see.
Oh,
So let me
okay.
set the stage. So your meta theory is set theory, right? Is some
Sure.
weak
Okay.
form of set of three.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. You're assuming
You
that there
can prove it's
exists.
a PA theorem, but we need cons EFC to get the result because
Great,
we're
great.
still in.
I sure wish people would really live up to that and be kind of have the reverse mathematics of their theorem
Oh,
because
I see.
they that's
I
often
think in
like,
the
oh,
paper
one
we
one
say,
can
I mean,
notice, right?
we're just building models of set theory, so
Great.
you can formalize the whole thing in arithmetic. PA plus con
Great,
CFC
great.
is going to be enough.
So you have the completeness theorem somewhere. You
Right.
assume that there are models of ZFC, and
Right.
now under that assumption, you can build plenty of models of ZFC, right? You're assuming that ZFC is consistent. You can apply the compactness theorem. You know that the incompleteness theorem is true. All sorts of different models have to pop up, therefore, because,
Right.
um, and okay, so you're playing this game and you're building two models, and those two models happen to have exactly the same natural numbers.
Yes.
Um,
So they
and
agree on what the objects are that are the natural numbers. They agree on how to add them and multiply them and the order. It's just literally identical structure of natural numbers.
Great. And does that happen to be the standard natural numbers?
No, it
Or
can't
no?
be.
Oh, it
If it's
can't
going
be
to have
this.
my
Okay,
feature, yeah, it has to be
great,
nice.
great. So, okay, so they agree on those things.
And they,
However, they do not agree that all the theorems that are true about that structure are the same.
yeah, but that's not said quite correctly. I mean, they can't know about the other guy. So the assertion that I'm making can't be made inside either one of them. What I'm saying is that there's a sentence
In a
in the language
concrete
of
sentence, a
arithmetic.
sentence that humans can.
No, it's a non-standard sentence.
Ah, okay, okay,
It
okay,
has to
okay.
be, unfortunately. I mean, if you're going to make this situation happen. So there's a sentence. They both think it's a sentence because it's got a Gödel code. It's a number. I mean, it's a
Go to
nice
code
number
to them.
to them. Yeah, it has a Gödel code. It has something that they think is a Gödel code. They have the same number, so they have the same Gödel codes. They agree on the syntactic structure of the sentence and how it's parsed, the whole parse tree. They agree on that. So they have this thing that they each think is a sentence, and one of them thinks that that sentence is true in the arithmetic, and the other one thinks that that sentence is false,
I see.
even
And
though they have the same, they're talking about the same structure. And so when I take this to show, I mean, the philosophical point that I would like to make with this example is that sometimes people are, for example, someone like Pfefferman is a monist about arithmetic, but a kind of pluralist or non-universalist about higher set theory, right? And there's this view that somehow, well, look, we all know what we mean by the natural numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, and so
yeah,
on.
yeah,
So
yeah.
this is
That and so on is
meaningful,
doing a lot of
right?
heavy lifting.
And sometimes you hear people say that, look, if the objects have a kind of definite nature, which numbers seem to a lot of people, then it follows that truth assertions about those objects also would have a definite nature. And it's that step from definiteness of objects to definiteness of truth that I'm trying to tear apart with this theorem. The theorem shows, look, you can have two models of set theory that agree on the numbers. The numbers are kind of have a kind of absoluteness for those two models, but the truth assertions do not. It's so the philosophical point then is that look, definiteness of truth just doesn't follow from definiteness of objects. You need something more. It's a higher order commitment to have definiteness of truth, and you don't get it for free. And so that's anyways a little more
So,
philosophical.
okay, let's see. So does this does seem mysterious, and I definitely don't know how to prove this theorem, but I can believe it. However, it'd be nice to know, let's see, does this work with models of PA, for example? So the things PA can state are much weaker than the things, a model of ZFC can state about its own natural numbers.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, most of we have a big variety of things, but they're all sort of at a higher level. I mean, it's all about like what's going wrong in ZFC. For example, we can make two models of ZFC that have a V sub alpha, a rank initial segment in common. And one of them thinks it's a ZFC model and the other one doesn't.
That's
But it's the same V alpha. I mean, it's a sort
right,
of a
right.
similar thing. Or we can make it on projective truth. So we can make two models of ZFC that have the same hereditarily countable set. So they have the same real numbers. And one of them thinks a certain projective statement is true and the other one does. I mean, it's the same kind of issue going on. Or we can make models that have, let's see, how does it go? There's an ordinal that one of them, no, I'm sorry. It's a program that one of them thinks computes a computable ordinal, but the other one thinks it's ill-founded. So that kind of thing.
I I have some very boring technical questions that I'm tempted to ask right
Sure.
now. Let's see.
We can talk
So
about whatever, yeah.
one is I was trying to understand the Gödel constructible universe, and
Okay.
that one confused me a little. So I feel like I kind of understand the technical aspects of the construction, but um okay. And again, this I feel this tension between the proof theorist and the set
Right.
theorist.
Right.
But okay, so you're constructing this hierarchy, and at each stage, you're adding kind of only um, sets that have this kind of description, I guess, that are constructible, the sets
Yeah.
that satisfy some predicate.
Yes.
Uh, so it better not be the case that once you have the natural numbers, so you're doing this an ordinal number of times, right? So you're doing this blah, blah,
Right.
bam, 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 but you're doing it an infinite number of times, and then you still have, an infinite number of infinities to go. So you do this omega many times. So far you only have finite numbers. Now you have omega, and bam, now you have some subsets of omega, just
Right.
just much bigger set internally, right? Because
Right.
it's some power
I
set.
mean, what you get at
However,
stage L sub omega plus one is going to add exactly the arithmetically definable sets.
great. And that from the outside is tiny, right? It's countable.
Yeah,
And
sure.
indeed, the next one is countable too, and the
Yeah,
next one too, right? And so you're adding tons of subsets from the internal perspective, but from the outside, you're adding nothing. You're not even getting close to
right.
the
But
power
this is
set.
exactly why L satisfies the continuum hypothesis because
Yes. Okay. Great. That's the bit I don't understand.
yeah, so you
Why
have
does
most of it. You have most of it because okay, so I mean we build this L alpha hierarchy. The Gödel's constructible universe L is built in stages L sub alpha and to go it's sort of like the V hierarchy where you iterate the power set except it's slower. So when we go from L alpha to L alpha plus one, then we do exactly what you said. Namely, we take the subsets of L alpha, not all of them, but only the ones that are definable in L alpha, right? And the point is that if alpha is countable, if L alpha is countable, then there's only going to be countably many
yes,
definable
sentences? Yeah.
subsets. So therefore, the next one is also still countable, and then the next one, and we're still just adding countably many each time. So all the way up to omega one, the first uncountable ordinal, we've only added countably many sets each time, and so therefore we have only omega one many reals altogether when we go all the way to omega one.
Okay. Great. Great.
Okay.
Great. Great.
And now all you need to know is that every real in L that's ever added at all,
It's done at omega
added,
one.
yeah, it's added by some countable stage. And so that's why CH holds in L.
Great. Okay. Okay. And then
That
the
the
reason why
second
that's
fact that
true,
every real that's added is added by a countable stage is a consequence of what's called condensation. I mean, we do it
condensation.
with the
Okay.
Lovenheim-Skolem argument and so on. So
Okay.
in general, you get not just the continuum hypothesis, but the generalized continuum hypothesis, because the same thing happens between L kappa. All subsets of kappa are added before kappa plus. And
I
there's
see. I see. I
kappa
see.
plus many subsets added by that stage, because each time you add only kappa many more. So you get
Okay.
the GCH by basically the same reasoning.
I like that. This explains a lot. Great. And let's see, my second question was a non sequitur, but I'll ask it anyway. I don't know. This is an indulgence. I've heard several times. So these two things are true. Um, It's generally true that um, if you have a well-founded order, sorry, if you have a, let's see how to say this. If you have a well-founded order, right? You know, some relation, some set relation, you can build a set such that that well-founded order is realized by by membership, right? You basically turn that into
It
uh
should be extensional also. I mean, I guess it's
oh,
true
it
in
should be
particular ways.
extensional.
I
Yes.
mean, it doesn't. Uh, let's see. I mean, you can just push it higher up. I mean, so I think what you said is actually technically correct also.
By accident.
No, no, it's so I'm not sure what the question is. You want to know
Okay,
how
so
to
that's
prove
the
that?
first part of the question. The second part of the question is, I often see, so in the classical axioms of ZF, there's, you know, an axiom of foundation. And
Right.
so if you have a model of ZF, one would be tempted to say it is pretty easy to build a transitive model of ZF where, you know, instead of having just any old model where you need to interpret membership in that model as a relation, you just interpret it as the real membership relation, right? And so somehow you squish that model down into a set,
But
and now
it's
you have
not
a set that is
true. I mean, a
model.
ZFC can be
That is not
consistent
true, right? Great. So tell
without
me why it's
having
not
a
true.
transitive model. I mean,
Oh, and sorry. Tell
go
me
ahead.
why it's not true, and also tell me how much stronger is this assumption that there is a transitive set
Right. Yeah. So
model of
you should think
ZC?
the assertion that there's a transitive model of CFC, you should think of it as a very weak large cardinal axiom. That's how I think about it. It's basically moving into the large cardinal hierarchy because it has consistency strength. For example, suppose we had a transitive model of CFC. So that model has arithmetic inside it. It has the standard natural numbers because it's a transitive model. And you can prove that it's correct about what it thinks are ordinals,
Ah,
particular
okay.
omega. So it has the real omega inside it.
I see. Okay.
And that means that it has the same proofs that we have.
Okay.
And
Okay.
therefore it thinks the same theories are consistent that we do. And we think CFC is consistent, so the model will also think it's consistent.
Ah, I see. I
So
see.
now we're not just thinking con CFC anymore. We're thinking con CFC because we
Yeah,
have a
yeah.
model of con CFC. But therefore we think that's true, and therefore it agrees. So we can do it again
Yeah,
and again
yeah. And so
and again.
so now you
So we
have this
get these
huge like
finitely iterated consistency towers this way. Yeah. So when you have a transitive model of CFC, then this is implying these huge towers of consistency hierarchies.
okay. So it is for a set theorist, it's a tiny bit stronger. For
Oh
a
yeah,
proof
tiny
theorist,
bit
it's
stronger. Yeah,
quite a bit stronger.
that's right. So there's actually some really interesting set theory concerned with, I mean, if there's a transitive model of ZFC, then there's going to be a shortest one because it has actual ordinals. It's correct about its ordinals. So there's going to be a shortest one. And if we take the L of that model, that's going to be
And just to be clear, it could be countable, right? There's nothing that forces
it
it to be.
definitely is countable because if there's a transit model of CFC, then it has a countable elementary substructure by Levenheim-Skolem. And therefore, that one has a Mistovsky
Wait.
homomorphic.
Sorry, just one beat there. Can
Yeah.
you apply Lowenheim-Skolem in this setting? I feel like you can definitely apply it in general, of
Every
course.
model has a countable elementary submodel.
Oh,
Yeah.
I see. Okay.
That's the
So
Levenheim-Skolem theorem. So in particular, if you have a transitive model of set theory, then it has a countable elementary submodel. It might not be transitive anymore, but every well-founded model is isomorphic to a transitive model. And that's related to this fact that you were starting with about
I
this
see.
well-founded relation being realized by the set membership. I mean, it's a theorem due to Mistovsky. We can talk about it if you want. Um,
Uh, I I don't know. There's a lot to talk about. Okay, so that right. Okay,
so there's
so
this
that
there's this countable model, a shortest possible one. If we take the L of it, it has a remarkable property. It's called the Shepardson-Cohen model. And the remarkable property is that it's pointwise definable, meaning that every element of it is definable by a formula without parameters.
Okay.
So it
And
means
that is in the meta theory.
it's a meta-theoretic assertion about that model.
I
Yes.
see.
But this minimal model, the Shepardson-Cohen model, it's
Okay.
it,
So what, okay, what's exciting about pointwise definability?
well, it's amazing. It's an amazing feature because it refutes the what I call the math T argument, which is that I mean, I'm sure you've heard people make this argument. It's very common, I think, that there must be some reals that are not definable because there's uncountably many reals, but there's only countably many
Sure.
definitions. Okay. But this model is a sort of counter model to that. It's a model of ZFC in which every single thing is definable, including every real number, every topological space, every function, everything is definable. So it's consistent with ZFC that the math T argument is totally wrong. I mean,
Um,
because
I'm
maybe
sorry. I feel like I'm missing a chapter here.
okay.
Th This is about the model, right? The model itself certainly doesn't think everything
Yeah,
in
it's not
itself is this.
expressible. You can't express I'm pointwise definable. I mean, the model can't think it has only countably many
Right.
reals because
Right.
Cantor's
Okay.
Cantor's theorem shows that
Right.
the
Right.
reals
Right. Right.
are uncountable.
So
So model, from outside the model, we look at it, it's a countable model, and we can observe, look, everybody in that model is definable in that model by a formula without any parameters. And it's a countable model. So it's related to the Skolem paradox about whether you can have countable models of set theory at all, and the answer
and,
you
and
can.
just to be clear, what does definable mean really? It means that if you interpret that formula by letting the quantifier range over sets in the model,
That it's true of only that one model.
okay, that is
So
true of
for an
only that one
individual to
model.
be definable means that they have a property that only they have.
I see, I see.
And by a property, I mean expressible in the language of the structure. So in the language of set theory here. So
Okay,
every
I'm
real
just trying to
number,
figure out how surprised I need to be about this result. So yeah, so it doesn't surprise me anymore, but as I've been thinking about it, that from the outside the reals can be countable, and from the inside, of course they're not. And this to a computer scientist, the can't possibly be too surprising, right? Because I know that all the reals are countable. I know that they're all realized by partial recursive functions, but 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 to a set theorist, of course, this is very surprising because they know the reals are just this smear
sure.
of like
I mean,
really
what it really shows about the what I call the Mathy argument is not that it's wrong, but that it's
subtle.
it's using definability as though it was an object theory concept, but it's not. It's a
I see.
metatheoretic
I
concept.
see. I
So the
see. So
mistake of the math T argument is saying, well, if there's only countably many definitions, but uncountably many reals. And both of those things are true in the Shepardson-Cohen model. But what the model lacks is the relation that maps the definition to the thing that it defines. That's what's not expressible inside the model. So the model has all the definitions and it has all the objects. And in fact, from outside the model, we can see that all of those individuals are definable by a formula, but the model can't put it together. It can enumerate the formulas, but it can't enumerate the things that those formulas define because
I
it can't
see.
express truth.
Right. Right.
Right?
Right. Okay.
It's a kind of gloss on Tarski's theorem, really, on the
So
non-ability of truth.
I promise I wouldn't talk about constructive mathematics. And
That's
I'm
fine.
really tempted to violate that promise. But let's see if I can make an analogy with this theorem between things I actually kind of understand. So it is if you have a constructive theory and there's a constructive set theory, which is kind of cool, though it's kind of weird. Um, you can
Is
definitely
CZF, is that what you're talking about?
what's that?
CZF, is that what you're talking about?
I'm talking about IZF, which is actually quite a bit
Okay.
stronger.
Okay.
But sure, why not CZF?
Okay.
Yeah, IZF is kind of nice, right? It's is as strong morally on arithmetic statements as ZFC is.
Okay.
Sorry, is that true? That definitely can't be true. It's as strong on pi 0 1 statements as ZFC is. In
I
fact,
don't
pi
know
zero
that much
two.
about it.
That's okay. All right, but who cares? It doesn't prove the excluded middle, so there's definitely plenty of functions you can't define. What you can even do is say every function from natural numbers to natural numbers is actually realized. Sorry, every partial function from natural numbers to natural numbers is actually realized by an algorithm. And you think, great, wow, that
Oh, I see.
sure feels
Okay.
like it proves that the functions from natural numbers to natural numbers is countable, but it doesn't because you can prove that that set is uncountable.
Right. Oh, I see. It's similar. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
so the paradox in some ways is if you know that you can enumerate all the total functions, right? Then you can diagonalize immediately because if you enumerate all the total
Sure.
functions, and there is a total function which, takes the diagonal and adds one.
Right.
And it feels like something similar is happening here, where you so in this theory, you know that all the partial functions are computable, and you know that all the total functions also happen to be partial functions. But somehow you can't quite put that together and
Right. You can't
say,
find them in order to do the diagonalization.
great, yes, yes, there you go. And it sounds like something is happening here. But here, of course, maybe the dance is even more subtle because you you definitely have the excluded middle, right? You have all the power of
Right.
classical
Right. It's fully
mathematics.
classical. Yeah.
Okay, okay. Now I'm now convinced that this is a cool result. All
There's
right.
another result. I mean, that result I think is kind of was known for some time, but there's another result, namely that every countable model of ZFC has a class forcing extension, which is pointwise definable. So,
Um,
so in
okay,
other
and
words,
this
you give me any countable model of set theory at all, then I can make it a little bigger and it becomes pointwise definable. I can do it in such a way that it becomes pointwise definable.
I see. And this is even more surprising, right? Because it feels like that first example was very small.
Right.
And now you're saying, oh, but actually, no, it doesn't have to be small from the outside. It could be much bigger from the outside from what you started
Exactly.
with.
And it works for Gödel-Bernays class theory also. I mean, we can make that pointwise definable as well. So,
Oh man, I have so many more questions. I don't know how much time you have actually. I should have, that's what the first thing I
yeah,
should have asked.
I'm totally fine. Yeah.
Okay, great. So let's see. Let's see, in piano arithmetic and in set theory, there are two kinds of kind of interesting theorems. One is in piano arithmetic, of course, you can't define truth. That's kind of the classic, again, a classic diagonalization argument, but a really an absolute one, right? One that's very forceful, and much simpler to prove. What you can do is define truth up to some finite bound of quantifiers.
Right.
If you chop off all the quantifiers up to some bound, then by kind of a dance, you really can define truth. You need an extra quantifier to give you the room, but
Right.
and this is quite useful. People use it, but it seems even more useful in ZFC. And in ZFC, you have a much stronger statement that I'm not sure I completely understand, which is what is it called? The reflection theorem.
Yes.
Do you want to state that just so that I don't embarrass myself?
Sure. The Levy-Montagu reflection theorem says the following: any statement that's true in a model of set theory, then there are many, many ordinals alpha, such that if you take the universe up to V alpha, the statement is true in that V alpha. In fact, you can get stronger versions, namely, there's a definable class, closed unbounded class of ordinals. For any formula, there's a definable closed unbounded class of ordinals such that the formula is absolute between V alpha in that class and V.
Sorry,
Which,
closed and bounded class of
so this is a
ordinals.
very thick big class of ordinals. It's sort of like measure one. I mean, one thinks of a closed unbounded classes as like measure one.
Oh, close unbounded is what you said.
Closed unbounded,
Oh, I
yeah.
see. Okay, okay.
The club classes,
I see, I see, I
it's
see.
closed and unbounded. So there's a, but I mean, the sort of primitive version is just saying there is an ordinal like that. That's a version of the reflection, but actually the proof gives you a much stronger result. It gives you this closed unbounded class. So
Okay.
what it shows is that nothing in ZFC, in models of ZFC, things are never true for the first time only in the universe itself. It was already true in this V alpha along the way many, many times,
Okay. And
even with parameters. That's the sort of formula version.
okay.
So,
And it seems to me that, for an existential statement, that seems very reasonable. You just add the set and then you close it under whatever operations you want to close it. And there you have kind of a box that holds
oh,
all the things you need.
once you have the witness, yeah, but this is for even for very complicated formulas with many levels of quantifiers, it's still true.
Okay.
I mean, basically, one way of understanding is there must be V alphas that are, say, sigma 3 elementary in V, a sigma 3 elementary substructure, or sigma n for any particular fixed n. You have to fix n. Of course, you can't prove in general that there's a V alpha which is elementary in V as an elementary substructure. That's not possible to prove. Because if it were true, well, you could have a least one and so on, and then and that one wouldn't have it. So I mean, so it's
I
too
see.
much to have a fully correct. So kappa is said to be correct if V kappa is an elementary substructure of V. If the universe up to kappa, if we chop it off at kappa and we look at the universe below that, that's V kappa, then to say kappa is correct means that the truth assertions in that V kappa are the same as they would be in all of V, in the whole universe.
Okay. And that thing must exist. I'm sorry, I
No,
lost the
no,
thread
no,
there.
those are the ones that don't necessarily exist. So
Ah, I see.
reflection
Okay.
is about being sigma n elementary for fixed n. So
I
it
see.
has the same truths of complexity n.
I see. I see. Okay. Those
So
must exist.
sort of the correct cardinals are sort of the limit of the sigma n correct cardinals. The
I
sigma
see.
correct cardinals always exist. That's the content of the reflection
Great,
theory.
great, great. Great. Okay, okay, okay.
Okay, but then
So,
what it shows something quite interesting by compactness. So, for example, we know that it's consistent with CFC that there's a kappa which is so that V kappa is sigma n correct in V.
right, that,
So
that.
let's write down the following theory. It's going to be in the language of set theory plus a constant
Yes,
symbol
yes, yes.
for
Okay, I see
kappa.
where you're going. Go ahead.
And I'm going to make the assertion first that kappa is sigma 1 correct, meaning that V kappa is sigma 1 elementary. But then I'm also going to make as a separate statement that it's sigma 2 correct and sigma 3 correct and so on. Okay. And by the reflection theorem, any finitely many of those statements is consistent with CFC. So therefore, by
Yes.
compactness, the whole theory is consistent. So what it means is that I can have V kappa being in a model of this whole theory. Now V kappa is fully elementary in V.
Ah, yes. Okay, okay. So this is exactly the analog of building a non-standard integer, right?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I think
You're
so.
making a set big enough to be to witness the truth of all these bounded, but for all bounds, and now you know that that thing is exists by compact. And it's somehow it's beyond all the sets maybe that were in that original model,
But now
but
something interesting happens though, if you think about this, because okay, V kappa is elementary in V, which is a ZFC model. But you might say V kappa therefore should be a model of ZFC. Okay. I mean, any given ZFC axiom will be true there. But does V has V kappa as an element? It's one of the, rank initial segments in the hierarchy. And does V think that V kappa is a model of ZFC?
mm, I
And
see.
the answer is no, you don't know that because maybe the
Yeah,
model
you can't know that, right?
not
Because
con
that's
ZFC. We
that's
could have added not con ZFC to this.
yes, 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 yes.
So the models might think that ZFC is inconsistent, and yet they think that in this V kappa, they think of any particular statement of CFC that it's true there, but they don't think that V kappa is a model of
I
CFC.
love so this V kappa is some secret set that is a model, but the theory just has no idea.
It's a model. It's actually a model of CFC, but the model doesn't think that it is because it has a wrong understanding of what CFC is. It
This
has
is
to be
really
an omega
fun.
non-standard model in these cases, right?
Can I just say, I feel like you're living the dream, right? When I was a young student, I was fascinated by these questions, and I really wanted to, my job to be to think about these questions. I guess it's now my hobby, but yeah, no, these are fun, and somehow these questions feel significant, right? Because we care
Yeah.
about mathematical truth, and it feels very core, right, to not just our identity as mathematicians, but also I don't know, the metaphysics of the
And
world.
I totally agree. I mean, this to me is like we're really learning something about the nature of truth and mathematical existence by looking at these kinds of things. I totally agree.
I was briefly an assistant professor at CMU, and wow, I don't know if I should tell this anecdote, but I've started, so I'll finish. It's not that bad. Really bright PhD student.
Did we overlap there? I was there in like 2003 or so. Maybe that was earlier.
No, I was there in some years I forget, to 2012, 2013, I think.
I see. Okay.
Um, I actually taught logic for a brief semester. Um, there was this bright student there. He was I think he was working on history of computer science, and he comes to me and he says, "But really, this seems crazy that any mathematician should still have this such an archaic view as Platonism. What century are they living in?" And he just seemed mystified. It was just
I see.
inconceivable to him that there could still be Platonists. And I was like, well, yeah, I assure you. But it does feel like mathematicians, right, get to be the last metaphysicists because they get to work very with these
Right.
mundane objects to them, but that are kind of metaphysical objects.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, the meaning of Platonism, I think, has changed over the years. So, like 20 or 30 years ago, it often was taken to imply monism, to imply a kind of uniqueness of the mathematical world, that there's only one Platonic realm. But I think this is now shifting. I think that Platonism is really about the sort of realism of abstract objects, even if you're a pluralist, you can still be a Platonist. For example, in geometry, right? I think most geometers are Platonists in the sense that they think of the Euclidean plane and also hyperbolic space and elliptical geometry and so on as, you know, the geometrical objects of those worlds are real abstract objects. And so they're Platonists in that sense, but they're also pluralists about geometry because they think there's multiple different geometric spaces, right? And so in set theory, similarly, one can be a Platonist in the sense of realism and yet a pluralist. Um, so I think um,
I,
years ago
I
that wasn't true, though. I mean, it
I
wasn't taken that way.
that's an interesting perspective. I would definitely not presume to claim to know what geometers think. I think I
Oh,
took
I see.
a semester of algebraic geometry, and now I'm like,
I see.
I have no idea what geometry is. Um, but let's see. Can we? I'm still a little afraid of abusing your time, but I'm gonna push
I have
it
plenty of time.
until
Yeah, let's
okay,
see.
great,
What time
great,
is it? Let me just look at the time. Yeah, I have plenty of time. I
great,
mean,
great. So let's talk about modalities and modal
okay.
logic. So
Right.
so okay, so if you have a way to describe, you know, um, let's see, I don't know. You tell me. How do you want to
Okay,
introduce the
sure.
subject?
I mean, let me just tell you how I sort of got into it a little bit. So there was years ago, I was told of a certain axiom, of an idea. It was a kind of question about Good. Okay, so in set theory, we have this method called forcing, which is a way of taking a model of set theory and constructing from it a bigger model, the forcing extension. You sort of add these new ideal objects. It's something like taking a field extension by adding transcendental elements or something. It's akin.
People often make that analogy, but I sometimes wish they would make that analogy precise.
Oh, I see.
Um,
Well, I can make
but
it more precise. So,
oh,
I
okay.
mean, the forcing extension has the property that it's also a model of ZFC, and it has a new object, let's call it G. It's the generic filter. And everything in V of G in the extension is directly constructible in a very concrete manner from something in the ground model together with G. But that's exactly like what's going on in the field extension. You add the transcendental element, and then you can build, polynomials with that element with coefficients from the ground model, from
so
the
modern day algebraists would say that the field extension has a universal property. Is there a similar universal property for
I
forcing
don't think
extensions?
so. I mean, these universal properties are very useful when you have a very rich theory of homomorphisms and
Sure.
so on. But it just doesn't, we don't apply homomorphisms to models of ZFC. It's not a fruitful endeavor. And so I kind of doubt that there would be, I mean, maybe one can invent some kind of universal property, but we're not working in the category of models of ZFC with a certain kind of morphism. I mean, you
Sure, sure,
could
sure.
cook it up, but it's just not a fruitful way of understanding models of set theory in the way that it is a fruitful way of understanding these algebraic structures like groups and fields and so on, because they do have useful morphism.
Okay. All right.
So,
So
right. So maybe there's a universal property. I'm not sure, but I'm thinking of it in a more concrete way, namely, like, you want to adjoin a root to the rational field, then the elements of the field extension are going to be basically polynomials in that new guy, or maybe ratios of polynomials. And so you can build the presentation in this computable manner, even from the ground model objects and the new ideal element. And that part of the analogy works great for forcing, because everything in V of G is delta zero definable from G and something in the ground model. I mean, it has a name in the ground model and it's G, and there's this recursive definition of how to understand what the value of the name tau by G is. And so I think that part is a fruitful metaphor for understanding the nature of forcing. But you're right. Okay, it
great,
would be
great, great.
straining it to say, well, it's just exactly like it. I would tend to agree that maybe it's a bit of an exaggeration. Um,
Great, great. Okay.
okay, so
So
anyways, this axiom or the idea, the proposal was, suppose you have a model of set theory and you're looking at its forcing extensions, and you have a statement that you could force in the sense that there's a forcing extension where it becomes true, such that it stays true in all further extensions. Okay. So, so the axiom would say that maybe all such statements are already true. Okay. So anything that could be made permanent is already permanent.
right. And
Okay.
for our viewers at home, the quintessential example of such an forcing extension is you take any model of ZFC, you can force it such that the continuum hypothesis is false. So you can build these like intermediate ordinals between, the natural numbers and the reals. And I guess I'm hard pressed to describe them, but this was, one of the monumental breakthroughs of set theory, which I've already talked about, but I feel like
Yeah,
the need to present so
absolutely.
again.
But actually, the continuum hypothesis is not an example of something that can be made permanent, though, because what's also true is that in any model of set theory, there's a forcing extension where the continuum hypothesis becomes true again. So it's what we call a switch, in the sense that you can turn it on and off.
Mm,
You can make CH false, as you said. That's Cohen's big result from 1963. But then Solovey had observed shortly after that you can make it true again by adding more sets. It's a little counterintuitive to say, well, I made it false by adding lots of real numbers, and that's how the continuum got big. So how do I make it true again? And the answer is that, well, you collapse those cardinals
Yeah,
that
and
you
somehow
have
collapsing
attributed,
them can be
make
done
them
with more
countable.
sets.
So you can make any set countable by adding a bijection between it and omega, and that's possible to do in such a way that you make the continuum hypothesis true again by so you had pushed up the value of the continuum, so there's all these intermediate cardinals that you mentioned, but then you can collapse those cardinals to make them countable again, and now the continuum hypothesis holds again in the further extension, and you can just keep doing it. You can make it true, false, true, false, true, false by going to successive extensions.
Great, great.
So, yeah. So this axiom, though, about the possibly necessary statements being already true, this is a modal way of saying that axiom. And this was my idea,
Okay.
is that we should understand that maximality principle in modal terms. So the main contribution of my paper on the maximality principle was this modal view of what's going on with forcing. So you have a model, then we can say something is possibly true with this is the forcing modality. It's possibly true if there's a forcing extension where it's true. And it's necessarily true if all forcing extensions think that it's true.
Great.
And then the axiom the modal axiom that expresses that principle would be diamond box phi implies phi. So if phi is possibly necessary,
I see, I see.
true.
Okay, the negation of the continuum hypothesis is definitely not one of those, right? It is
Yes. It's a
it's
switch. So
diamond, right? So it's
it's
diamond, it can be
possible, but the
true, and
negation
then
is also possible. It's a
right,
necessarily possible
right,
statement, which is also the negation is necessarily
right.
possible.
And that, of course, is not a theorem, as we know. And
Yes.
so, okay, so that's not a counterexample to this thing, right? We're
Right.
saying that anything the hypothesis was anything that can be possibly some forcing extension makes it true, and then all subsequent forcing extensions
Yes.
keep it true.
That's any
And
possibly necessary, right? It's
right, that
possible that it becomes necessary.
great. And the
Yeah.
hypothesis is all those things were already theorems. They're already true, right? Right
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
in
Well,
set
not
C.
theorems, but they're just, I mean, so we're adding the implication that possibly necessary phi implies phi. Not as a rule, but it's just, can you have a model of set theory that already thinks all those implications
Oh,
hold?
I see, I see, I see. Is it consistent to have
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
this
And it's
principle?
easy to see that it's consistent because by compactness, for any finitely many of them, I mean, for example, for any particular phi, you can make it satisfy that by just making phi necessary. But like if it is possibly necessary, then there's a model where it's necessary. And so that's a model where the
I
implication
see. I see, I see, I see.
it's
Of
sort of
course,
trivial, right?
forcing extensions can't make something that was already true not true. That's definitely
They
like
can't make something well, I mean, they can change the truth. So they can make, they can make things that
I
were
see.
false, like continuum hypothesis, we can make it true and then false and then true and then false again. So we can change the truth, but what you can't do is that if something was necessary, make it false, right?
I see, I
I mean,
see.
that's the definition of
Do
being.
you have an example of a necessary truth? Oh,
Oh,
I feel like I might have a couple, but you
yeah.
go.
So for example, the omega 1 of L is countable.
I see.
So L is the constructible universe, and it has its cardinal, which is its first uncountable cardinal, which is called omega 1. So that would be the omega 1 of L, the omega 1 as L sees it. But we can force to make that countable. And once we do that, it's going to stay true. It's never going to become uncountable again in a further extension. So therefore, it's possibly necessary that the omega 1 of L is countable.
And that's because it let's
You could
see.
force to make it countable, and once you do that, it's going to stay countable. So it's
It,
possibly necessary that it's
is
countable.
that easy to see? I mean, I'm sure it's easy to see to you. Can you
I
explain
mean,
why that's the
forcing has
case?
this property. I mean, we haven't explained why, but any set can become countable in a forcing extension. It's one of the basic
Great. But
facts.
why does it stay countable?
Because you have the bijection with omega,
Oh,
and
and
it's not
it's
going
there
away.
forever.
It's
Okay.
still
Great.
there. Yeah.
Okay.
Once
So
a set becomes countable, then it's forever countable. I mean, if we're
great.
thinking of the set as in the de re sense, not the de dicta sense, like the reals can become countable, but they're not the reals anymore. Once you do that, you have new reals. So, but it's the old set of reals. So it's the de re
Yeah,
reference
I
to
can see.
old reals, not the de dicta reference, if you know what that means. So it's,
I'm
are
gonna
we
pretend I
thinking of
do.
the object or are we thinking of the object under a description, right? And so
I
I'm
see.
talking about the object itself can be made countable even though it no
Great.
longer satisfies the same definitions that it used to.
That makes sense. Great. Okay, so okay, we've set the stage. There are
Mhm.
some statements that have this property. There are some statements that from our point of view, do not have this property. And the question is, can we consistently add to ZFC that all forcing extensions have this property?
Yes.
And the
No,
answer
no, no, no,
is,
just not that they all have this property, but rather that all those implications are true, that diamond box phi implies phi.
oh yeah, sorry.
So
Yes,
that's
sorry.
a scheme of assertions in the language of set theory, and we're going to add it to CFC. That's the maximality principle theory. It's making all assertions of that form.
I see. So,
And it's equiconsistent.
okay, and that is the case.
Yeah. So this way of thinking about that maximality principle, which was, by the way, there's versions of it also studied by Stavi and Bananen earlier, but they didn't have this modal way of
I
thinking.
see.
This
So you're
was my
saying
first.
the maximality principle is an axiom that one
It's
can
an
consistently
axiom.
add, and people have been studying this and trying to understand it.
Yes.
But but we now want to rephrase it as one of many modal logic statements of
Yes.
predicates where
Because
this modality has a very specific interpretation as
this
forcing
axiom,
extension.
diamond box phi implies phi, that's the central axiom of S5. That's the S5 axiom. That's exactly what it means to have S5.
Um, I hate to say to be that guy, I guess, but what does S5 tell
Oh, I mean,
us?
there's this whole spectrum of
Right,
modal
right.
logics or modal. I prefer to call them modal theories, but for some reason, this terminology of modal logics. I mean, to me, they have the character of theories because it's a set of sentences on a. But if you're a proof theorist
Well,
doing modal
yeah,
logic, then you want to think of the modal logics as defined by deduction rules. But actually, when you're doing modal logic of forcing and modal model theory, I would argue that's the wrong way to do it because it doesn't work with parameters. It's about the models really and about the sets of sentences. It's about the modal language in regard to the sets of sentences rather than about deduction rules. And you too much about the deduction rules because a lot of them don't work properly. For example, um, um, necessitation rule is often not true in these models. It's not valid in these models. But most of the modal logics that you want to talk about, like S4, S5, S4.2, and so on, they all, if you define them proof theoretically, then you use the necessitation rule. But actually, the necessitation rule is exactly wrong in this model theoretic way of thinking because I can make a statement about an individual, but it doesn't mean I'm saying that the necessary form of that statement is
I
true.
see.
And
I
so
think I
when
see
you
what you're
allow
saying.
parameters, when you're looking at whether parameters are allowed, then universalization and necessitation are both going to be wrong. They don't work.
Okay. As a gentle pushback for my proof theory friends,
Sure.
of which I'm certainly a weak representative,
Right.
one would often say that if your logic is not giving you the correct theory, then you just need to find a better, a better set of like rules,
No,
and
I
you need
agree.
to
Yeah.
make these
So
things a little bit
you
finer.
should jump over to the model theory side
Yeah.
instead of that.
I I I'm pessimistic that this podcast is really going to change minds. Um, but okay, so
I mean, for example, we don't know if the modal logics in some of these cases are normal modal logics and so on. So this is exactly related. We don't have any proof that it's normal. And so this is this is very much related to the question of whether there is going to be a natural or a fruitful deduction rule way of describing the validities.
Cool. All right, so popping up a
Okay,
stack.
sure.
So S5, so I know basically up to S4. One of these, I think S4 is plus the love rule is this fascinating provability logic that was studied,
Oh
in
no,
the
that's different. Yeah. I
um
mean, the love rule is not valid for forcing, but S4, let's see. So, I mean, S4 is about reflexive transitive frames, right? So it's saying that box phi implies phi. So if something is necessary, then it's already true. And if something is necessarily necessary, then it's necessary. So those are expressing reflexivity and transitivity of the frame. But that's exactly what we have in forcing, right? I want to think of the forcing modality is every model is accessing all of its forcing extensions, including itself if we think of trivial
right.
forcing. And then because of iterated forcing, a forcing extension of a forcing extension is just also achievable in one step by the iterated forcing. And therefore it's transitive, and that's why we get S4
Great,
base.
great. So S4 is somehow the possible worlds that you can always reach, and then if you reach one, you can reach the next one. And then S5 is
S5 adds this axiom diamond box V and plus V. So if something is possibly necessary, then it's true.
and what? Let's see, what are the Kripke the frame conditions?
Oh, the frames for S5 are the equivalence relations. So it's
Okay,
sort of
okay.
trivial. But this is another point, actually, because, okay, when I first proved the consistency of the maximality principle and I was expressing it in terms of S5, and I would have modal logic people in the audience, and they knew this frame characterization of S5 in terms of equivalence relations. It should be reflexive, symmetric, and transitive. I mean, the symmetry part. And they would say, oh, they would come up to me after the talk or in the Q&A, and they would say, therefore, the forcing extension relation is symmetric, right? And I
Yeah.
would say, no, it is not symmetric. Of course, it's not symmetric because the universe is getting bigger. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah.
it's not a symmetric relation. And
Great.
it gets to this point that a lot of logicians studying modal logic are doing so with the frame semantics point of view. They really want to think about frames. Frames is the underlying accessibility relation of a Kripke model. And when you do frame semantics, you implicitly allow yourself to put any Kripke model on that same frame to change truths and adjust them around and so on. And that's what it means really to be doing frame semantics. For example, if you have trees as frames are complete for S4, for example, or convergent orders are complete for S4.2. Convergent means that if you start in a point and you go to two places, then you can go together again.
Hmm.
And And so if you have this frame point of view, then you would be led to think, oh, the maximality principle should imply somehow that forcing extension
Yeah, it looks
separation
like
and
these.
equivalence relation. But of course, it's nothing like an equivalence relation. I mean, because they get bigger as you
Yeah, yeah,
go.
yeah. Okay, okay.
And
So
so, and so what I realized is that no, the modal logic of forcing and what grew into modal model theory, which is looking sort of generally at, doing model theory with this sort of possibility operator. Um, it's never symmetric, but sometimes you get S5 being valid anyways. And so it's not about the frame, it's about the Kripke model. Okay, the modal logicians who are studying frame semantics think any particular model is sort of maybe, I mean, I sense that the idea is that, to look at a particular model is too restricted and trivial and so on. They want to understand how the frame works. But that's not a fruitful perspective for understanding the modal logic of forcing or for understanding modal model theory, because the frame is just like a feature of the structure of all the models of the theory. And we're not going to put a different Kripke model on that frame. We're never going to change the models. We really want to understand just the Kripke model of all models of set theory under the accessibility relation. And we're not going to be swapping those models out and putting in other models with different truths in the same slots. I wouldn't even know how to
Okay.
do that in
But
specific.
can we try to unpack this
Sure.
this S5 axiom and try to maybe um
Maybe it's better to
give
talk
some
about
intuition a little bit.
S4.2. S4.2 is maybe fruitful. So, because later, I mean, when we did this S5 thing, then it opened up this modal way of thinking, and it led to the question, well, what are in general the modal validities of forcing? What is the modal nature of forcing? Like, if you have this view, forcing
Yeah.
is about taking a model of set theory and making bigger models. So there's this vast Kripke model of possible worlds that just flows immediately from that perspective. And I want to know, well, what is the modal logic of forcing? And so I asked this question, and at first I didn't know very much modal logic in the beginning, and I thought this is a hopeless question. It's just going to be too difficult to answer. And then Benedict Lovett happened to be visiting me in New York, and was from Amsterdam at the time, and there's a lot of modal logic happening there, and he knows a lot of modal logic. And he said, let's attack this question. Yeah, what is the modal logic of forcing? And so at first, what was our
And can I already say it's kind of miraculous that the modal logic of provability is so nice, right? It's
sure, right.
decidable.
Yeah, yeah. Salive's result, you mean on the Gödel-Loeb logic. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, so this is like a forcing version of that question, right? It's exactly analogous. And so I remember sitting at this cafe in the financial district with Benedict when we were first getting into it, and we had this big book, one of these big black books. I can't remember now which one it was, of modal logic, and it has hundreds of modal theories in there, right? And this was many years ago, and I didn't know very much modal logic at the time. And so what did we do? We just started. I said, well, look, here's a modal assertion, and it's
Yeah.
like some strong, long string of diamonds and boxes and whatever. And, is it right for forcing, and we would say, no, because what if CH fails, and, we would make a
Yeah.
counterexample. And so,
Yeah, and of
so we would,
course, set theorists have been doing this for decades, right? They've been,
yeah, no, this is the
picking
first time. Yeah. So when we were looking at this modal thing, is we were
they've
just,
been doing this like here's a bunch of principles. Let's see if we can force this one and not this one and this one and not
oh,
that one,
right,
right?
exactly, exactly. So
They have
we,
been doing that.
yeah, so we needed to draw on that knowledge of that kind of stuff about what's possible to achieve in forcing in order to see, like, is this modal assertion valid or not? And we could sort them. We could prove S4 was valid for forcing because it's transitive and reflexive and so on. Basically, that's easy. And we could gradually refute many others. And so we zeroed in, and finally we found the point two axiom, S4.2. The point two axiom is, well, it has a number of different ways to say it equivalently over S4, but one of them is saying that if something is possibly necessary, then it's necessarily possible. So diamond box V implies box diamond phi is a way of saying it. There's another way to say it also, which is that if phi is possibly necessary and psi is possibly necessary, then the conjunction is possibly necessary. So that's kind of nice because what it's saying about the universe is that if you start in a world and you can go here and make phi true forever, and you can go here and make psi true forever, then you can make both of them true forever. And the answer is just product forcing. So if there's some forcing notion here and another one
Yeah.
here,
So
but we have convergence in
great, great,
the
great.
in the in the generic multiverse. I mean, we can put forcing notions together, and that product forcing is a forcing extension of each of them, and therefore it will have phi and psi. Okay, so that shows that point two is valid. So the answer, I mean, at first we thought the answer might be S4, but point two
Yeah,
is valid.
here's
So it's
something beyond.
S4.2. And then basically all the known axioms that were stronger than S4.2, we were able to show are not always valid. So
Wow.
it
Okay, so
was
you're
strongly,
exactly
I mean, we
there.
checked hundreds of them, right? So it was very much converging to S4.2 as the likely answer, and that's ultimately what we proved. The modal algebra
Okay, so so
is
the so
exactly
okay,
S4.2.
great. So you
So
really know that the exactly. Okay, and how would one go about proving this? I have to say I'm a little sad. I don't really understand the provability logic result. I don't have a good intuition about why that's true,
oh, I
right?
see. Right,
Um, let's try for this much more sophisticated result.
right. You need
What?
to know, well, what are the frames for S4.2? What is a complete set of frames for S4.2? And S4.2 is about convergence. So S4 is about partial orders in general. Those are complete, but actually trees also. Um, uh, and S4.2 is not about trees, but about if you start at a point and you go to two places, then you can go and bring them together again. So if you can access this one and that one, then they can both access a common
Okay, so
further
some kind
order.
of four-person
Right,
lattice.
something, yeah, it's called convergence. If every a partial order is convergent, if for every point, whenever it's below 2 points, then there's a common upper bound. So, or I guess it should be directed. So, and then what we proved, Benedict and I, so if you have directed partial orders, this is a complete set of frames for S4.2. And then we were able to show the baled trees, finite baled trees are complete. So it's like a tree, except at the top, it all comes together to a node at the top of the tree. So it's
I
baled,
see.
tied together the branches.
Okay.
That's called a baled tree. And then we also proved that the finite Boolean algebras, I'm sorry, I should say pre-baled trees, because each node should be like a little cluster of equivalent nodes. So that it's a
I see.
pre-order rather than an order. So the quotient by the equivalence is a baled tree. And the finite pre-Boolean algebras is also a complete set of frames. So it's a partial order so that if it's a partial pre-order, meaning that it could have clusters of nodes that are all less or equally to each other. So we have all these clusters. And if you mod out by those clusters, then you get a Boolean algebra.
Great. And set theorists love Boolean algebras.
Sure. So these are complete for S4.2 in this, and what that means is that any statement that's not in S4.2, any modal assertion not in S4.2, then there's a finite Kripke model whose underlying frame is a pre-Boolean algebra such that phi is not true at the root of that model.
Great.
So that therefore, what we need is to simulate these Boolean algebras, pre-Boolean algebras. Okay, so the way we did it was we invented this, what I call the control statement method, buttons and switches. So a switch is like a CH, it's a statement you can flip it on and off. And what we used the switches for was to control where you are in a given cluster. Yeah, so each node in this finite pre-Boolean algebra is going to be identified by a certain configuration of switches. So we need not just one switch, but we
Yeah,
need
some
finite,
an
we need
arbitrary yeah, finite number.
independent that you can control independently to make any pattern you want. Okay.
Okay, and that was known to exist.
Well, we had to,
No, you had to come up with one?
yeah, I mean, we had to do it. I mean, it was using just classic forcing constructions. Actually, it was sort of funny. The first example that we did, oh, I'm sorry, it was about the buttons, not the switches. The switches were fine. For example, we can make the GCH pattern on the finite Aleph ends whatever we want. You can have 2 to the Aleph 0 be Aleph 2 and 2 to the Aleph 1 be Aleph 5, or I mean, you can make any pattern subject to certain rules. So you can make the GCH hold or fail at Aleph n independently.
Right,
So those are switches,
right.
independent switches. You can control them independently. And now the buttons these should be statements that are possibly necessary, but not yet true. So it's
Okay.
like
Yeah, so
you can
once you've
push,
pushed it, you've pushed it, but you
yes.
haven't pushed it yet necessarily.
Exactly. And what we need are finitely many independent buttons. Independent means you can push whichever one you want without pushing the others accidentally.
Okay, and you gave one example of such a button, which was
like collapsing.
countability of omega 1 in L.
And at first, in the original paper, we said, oh, just the collapsing olefin. And we claimed this is independent, but it was wrong, actually. We made a mistake on that. But meanwhile, we also, elsewhere in the paper, also mentioned another system of buttons, which is that you can partition omega 1 into disjoint stationary sets, and the stationarity of those sets can be killed by club shooting forcing. And
Take your
these,
word on that.
so it's a more technical thing, but you can define a certain partition of an uncountable set in such a way that each piece is somehow large with respect to the club filter, positive measure, and you can change that in a way that's for any one slice, you can make it measure zero by
Mm,
by adding a
okay.
certain club. Okay, it's technical, but anyways, these make independent buttons.
Great, great,
And
great,
now, if
great.
you think about a Boolean algebra, well, any node in a pre-Boolean algebra is determined by the atoms that it's above and which node in its cluster it's on.
Yes, I think, okay. This has
Okay.
got to be some kind of stone theorem.
Yeah, I think so. Or it's just kind of obvious. Like if you're in a Boolean algebra, you have the atoms and the coatoms, and every node is above a certain collection of the atoms. And then if they're clusters, then you have to say which point you're on in that
Okay,
cluster.
and so now you have ways of naming the position of
So
that
every
element.
model of set theory in any forcing extension, it maybe it's pushed some of the buttons, and maybe it has a certain pattern in its GCH on the olefins, and so it can be associated with a node in that frame. So we've all the models of set
Okay,
theory
okay.
fit into this frame
So
at exactly one point.
great. Okay, so you have these gadgets, and you know how to use those gadgets to create a frame, and that frame is going to be the frame for the
So
the
what it means,
realizer of that of
yeah,
some
exactly. So
modal
if a
logic
statement
sense.
is not in S4.2, then there is a finite pre-Boolean algebra on which it's false. And we can take that model and we can simulate it in set theory with forcing. And therefore, the statement will not be valid for forcing. That's
Great, great, great,
basically
great.
what we can do.
So you prove one direction, which is all the axioms of S4.2 are true due
That's
to
that's
known
easy
and
to show that it's valid. And this one gets the upper bound, right? So the upper bound is
great.
much, much harder
Okay,
because
okay,
it
okay.
goes through all this technology with the control statements and everything. So
Okay, though I would
it was
argue that
great happy to
perhaps
prove this. It was really, I mean, because at first I thought this is going to be impossible, and Benedict said, "No, let's try it," and he was totally right. I mean, so because
that's a good lesson in there.
yeah, I think so, yeah. And now, of course, it grew into other things, the modal theory stuff. I mean, at first I thought modal logic of forcing is about forcing, but then my perspective on it changed when I realized, look, we can do modal graph theory, just
Yeah, I
take
see. I see.
graph.
The blackboard behind you.
Oh, well, that's right. Yeah, these are relations. Reflexive transitive closure, right?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I thought they were things that you could express in the modal logic of graphs, but I was wrong.
I see. No, I think it's a picture of if you have a certain, let's see, if you have a graph, a directed graph, then this is its reflexive closure and symmetric closure and transitive closure and
Right,
so
right,
on.
yeah, yeah, it's useful.
Here's the reflexive symmetric transitive closure of the original relation. Um,
Um, Great. Okay, so yeah, so you can use this idea of using modal logic to look at extensions and
of
use
any kind of mathematical structure. Yeah. So like take all graphs under the induced subgraph relation. So we say a statement is possible in a graph if there's a bigger graph where it's true.
right. I mean, I feel like the relation is important here, right? You're taking a structure and a relation,
Yeah,
right?
right. Yeah. So we have the class of all graphs. I mean, it's a proper class, right? And we're looking at the subgraph relation. Induced subgraph is what we look at, meaning that you don't add edges between old nodes, but you can add new nodes, new vertices, and new edges
Hmm.
to those new
That
vertices.
I'm slightly amused here, and I'm sorry I'm interrupting you, which is
No, no,
terrible,
sure.
terrible podcast host etiquette. But I feel like a set theorist approaches this problem completely different than a graph theorist would approach this problem, right?
Oh,
A
I
graph
see.
theorist would. I'm not sure I don't know many graph theorists, but I'm not sure they would take that same relation, right? They would be like, oh, graph minors is the obvious, relationship
Oh, I
between
see.
graphs.
Yeah, maybe you're right. Yeah,
Uh,
probably. I haven't thought so much about that. I mean, of course, this, I would thought you were going to say something else, which is that uh, embeddings instead of identity is also natural. Mathematically, it's a much more robust
yeah.
accessibility notion. Um, uh, it relates actually, so because this is a form of potentialism, I mean, and it's related to potentialism. Whenever you have a class of models and you have an extension concept on the models, then I view this as a form of potentialism. Yeah, because you can take on board all the modal language about possibly necessary and everything, in the context of these models with extensions. And for example, models of arithmetic or models of set theory can get bigger
Yeah.
by forcing, or models
It,
of arithmetic can get bigger and so on.
it's
Or
a very dynamic view of mathematics, right? Mathematics tends to feel very static to a student, right? It's
oh, I
theorems,
see.
they're
Right.
true, they're false. There's conjectures, but we'll solve those someday. But this is not that. This is a very different dynamic view of like we live in a world, but it could be possibly later a different world.
Right. Well, I mean, if you think about sort of Aristotelian potentialism, for example, you have finite many numbers, but you could have more. So we can make the world larger, right?
Yes.
And when philosophers approach potentialism, they tend to think of it like that, where you have some individuals and then you get more individuals, but the old individuals are still the same. You haven't changed them or you haven't taken counterparts or something. So they want to think about inclusion relation on the worlds. And it's
Yeah,
very
yeah.
natural from that point of view. But mathematicians rather find it more natural to look at embeddings of one structure in another, an isomorphic copy. So there's in effect a counterpart there, right? And and but luckily, uh, my student Wojciech Voroshin and I proved that if you're looking at, say, the models of a first order theory, like all groups or all graphs or all fields or all models of set theory or whatever your theory is, then the modal logic that you get from the inclusion relation versus the modal logic that you get from the embedding relation are the same.
Ah, I see. Okay.
So the modal assertions don't distinguish, they're identical. So if I say
Okay.
possibly phi or possibly necessary phi implies whatever, then I'm going to get the same answer whether I'm using the philosopher's identity inclusion or whether I'm using the mathematician's embedding. I get exactly the same assertions. So
Okay,
that's
but
that
can you
was
just
very
remind me
welcomely solved.
can you just remind me what embedding is in this context?
I mean,
It's
just like for example, maybe I have a graph and it's isomorphic to a subgraph of another graph.
I see.
So
And
I want to
so
say something is possible in a graph if I can if I can embed it, if I can find an isomorphic copy of it inside a larger graph that satisfies the statement. It's a different way of thinking what it means for one world to access another. If I just find an isomorphism into it, or if it has to literally be
right, right.
identical.
I'm just wondering if this theorem you just stated is obvious to me. And let's see, it
Oh,
might
I
be
see.
obvious to me if isomorphisms preserve all true first order sentences.
Yeah, that's
Um,
true in mod T. I mean, basically, that's how the argument goes. It's not very
okay, great.
difficult. But it was confusing at first because people were, say, appealing to, I mean, they have very different mathematical properties. For example, the inclusion relation is almost never directed or convergent because I can have a group and it can sit inside a group over here and it can sit inside a group over there, but there's no way to put those groups together because the same individual was used here in a way that's
Yes, 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 yes,
incompatible.
yes.
So therefore, the philosopher's way of doing it with actual identity inclusion is not convergent, and therefore you might think, oh, therefore S 4.2 isn't going to work because it's not convergent. Whereas the embedding one is convergent because we can do amalgamation kind of things. Yeah. And so S4.2 is valid. So, but because the modal statements are the same, it means that actually the philosophers get S4.2 anyway, even though their system isn't convergent because
I
it's
see.
equivalent to one that is.
I see. I see. Okay, that's fascinating. So, man, maybe I should start wrapping this up.
Okay.
So this modal logic of graphs, is there, I remember reading that paper and finding it extraordinarily interesting and also kind of cute. I don't know if one can
Right.
say that
There's a
about math
nice little
results.
result at the beginning of it, which I can talk about. I mean, I think maybe your listeners will understand it. Okay, so we're looking at all graphs, and the in the language of graph theory, but in the modal language of graph theory, so we can say possible also. And possible phi is true in a graph if there's a bigger graph where it's true. And I mean, if it's a subgraph of a bigger graph in which its statement is true. And so the question is, well, what kinds of things can you say in this modal language? And look,
Okay.
go ahead.
I'm committing terrible abuse of your time, but can we give an example of a statement that is not possibly true and an example of a statement that's possibly true?
So, for example, possibly diameter 2 is true in any graph.
So sorry, say that again.
Possibly the diameter is 2. What does it mean to say the diameter is 2? It means any 2 points are connected by a path at length at most 2. So I
Right.
claim every graph thinks possibly the diameter is 2. Because if I have a graph,
Yeah.
okay, maybe it's got isolated points or whatever, and it doesn't have diameter 2, but I could add one more point that's connected to everybody, and now it has diameter 2.
Great, great. So
So
you're not allowed to add edges between existing
yeah,
nodes.
that's what makes it induced subgraph instead of,
Okay.
yeah, sometimes people do.
But of course, yeah, you can see that, hey, all graphs are not that far away from each other, possibly, because I can
Yeah.
just create, a new highway between them.
So for
Um,
example, here's a switch. A switch is a statement. Remember, you can turn it on and off. Yeah. Can you give me a switch? Can you do?
I'm sorry, I'm
Okay.
not sure I can.
Okay. So let's make a statement about graphs that you could make it true in a
Oh
bigger
yes, oh
graph.
yeah, I'm sorry, I can.
Okay.
Connected, is that a switch?
Connected is not expressible though in the language of graph theory.
Oh,
It turns out it is expressible in modal graph theory, but that's a more
okay,
complicated.
okay, okay, okay.
Yeah.
So
But connectedness by compactness, it can't be expressible in the first order language of graph theory. But it is a switch. So you're totally right, except that
yeah,
it
okay,
itself
so
is expressed in the larger language.
all right, I'm out
Maybe a
of
more elementary
ideas.
example is there is an isolated point.
I see.
I
Okay.
can just add one, and now it's true, and that's expressible. You know, there is an X such that nobody is connected to X. Uh,
Great,
so I can add one if I don't have one, and I can destroy them all by adding a new point connected to everybody, and that
great,
kills
great,
them
great,
all.
great.
So
Okay, yes.
so I can turn it on and off, right? So that's a switch. So now we would want to know about buttons, independent buttons, for example. How about there's a triangle?
Yes, okay.
Okay, I could add one, but once I have one, it's gonna stay
It's
there,
there. Great,
right? Or there is a subgraph of a finite subgraph of a certain nature, then once you have it, then it's going to stay there. So those are buttons. So here's a good example. Two colorability is expressible in the modal language, but it's not.
yeah, that seems miraculous, right? It feels like true colorability is there exists, a partition or, for every node, either the node is this color and it's that color and all the things it's connected to. It feels like you really need
Yeah, it's like a
quantifiers
second
there.
order thing, but you can express it in modal graph theory. So you want to color the vertices red and blue so that adjacent vertices get opposite colors, right? So we can say it like this. Possibly there are two vertices. Okay. such that everybody is connected to exactly one of them, and neighbors are connected to them oppositely.
Right, right. Okay.
So then, yeah.
So it's a local language. You can talk about neighbors.
Well, the edge relation, the graph relation, yeah, that's what I mean by a neighbor. So, so I'm going to say, look, if you have any graph, then I can show that it's two colorable by adding a red node and a blue node and connecting them. I connect the new red node, to all the blue points in the original graph, and I connect the blue node to all the red points. So if it is two colorable, I can add two vertices that have that feature. And if I can have two vertices with that feature, then those vertices define a coloring. So it would be two colorable. So therefore, two colorability, I mean, the existence of a coloring with two colors, a vertex coloring with two colors, that's expressible in the modal graph theory language, but it's not expressible in graph theory in the
That's
first order.
delightful. Yeah,
Yeah.
that I love that.
Yeah.
That's great. I would recommend any listener to read what is the paper called? Do you
It's
happen to
called
remember?
modal model theory, and it's published in the Notre Dame Journal of Formal Logic. It's also on the archive, and it's with my
Great.
student Wojciech Wojwoshin.
Thank you for pronouncing that name for me. Great. Yeah,
Mispronounced it, but
I
yeah.
remember being delighted by that paper, even
Oh
though
yeah,
I did
it's not
not
that good.
remember this example, unfortunately. Um, but yeah, no, this is cool stuff. Let's see. I'm not very good at wrapping these things up. Are there final remarks you'd like to make? Um, you know,
Well, it's a pleasure talking with you.
all
Yeah.
right, yeah, same. I can only hope you'll come back again. I know you're a very busy
Oh, I'd
person,
love to. Yeah, we can talk
but
about
this is great, and hopefully, what we talked about was quite technical. Hopefully, as time progresses, I'll have more and more little chunks of like explanations of these things. Of course, this isn't an online course. Like you won't understand class forcing by listening to a bunch of podcasts, but it gives a
it.
taste, right? It gives a taste of what's beautiful and mathematically intricate, and a taste of why, you know, philosophically it might be satisfying to see these results and understand how they live within the broader kind of philosophy of mathematical existence that I care a lot about, even though, basically an ultra-scientist. I don't want to commit too hard because I don't feel like I have the mathematical chops to commit too hard. Um, and I saw you're going to talk about ultra-scientism soon.
Yeah,
So,
that's right. There's a conference this weekend at Columbia. Yeah, I'm going to speak.
is there any chance that that's going to make it online
I'm
or?
not sure. I don't know. I didn't see whether they have. Well, some of the speakers are via Zoom, so maybe they're going to put the whole thing on Zoom. I'm not sure. I would recommend contacting the organizers. There's a web page now, and maybe there's information there. I don't know.
Okay, great, great. Yes, again, I was delighted. I hope you'll come on soon again. And to all our viewers out there, until next time, and take care.
Yeah, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Great.